Hello, and welcome to day 7 of the mandatory quarantine show. It's much warmer today, much nicer. Don't really need this. Don't really need the gloves today. Just sitting out in the backyard. Uh, Yesterday, I guess the Canadian government must have phoned, but they didn't phone on the same number that they were supposed to phone on that they told us to monitor, so we thought it was a telemarketer, and they still have yet to call back, so we're just sitting out here and everything's perfectly fine. No symptoms to report, nothing to really talk about. Last night we watched was it now Naked Gun with the old movie, the comedic one, and had a Delicio Rising Crust pizza for dinner. So um, some people were wondering, oh, can I get delivery? And not really in the local area. So a lot of our stuff is just already was brought in at the start of the thing. So we got a lot of frozen stuff that we're working our way through, anyways. So we're at the halfway point, day 7 of this experience. Um, and I thought one of the things that I want to talk about is just what is kind of the history of quarantines and what is this thing. And I really hate that everyone seems to say, oh, we live in unprecedented times. Well, no. That just shows that you have no sense of history or the background of all of this. This is not unprecedented to have such a outbreak. If we want to go back even to 1918 with the Spanish flu pandemic that moved through, um, that was probably to this sort of level in terms of the amount of afflicted and the outcomes of it and some of the actions. So even there, with people wearing masks, that has been seen inside of the 1918 flu pandemic, is that people were basically either sheltering indoors, that they limited the distances between people, that houses were marked in terms of quarantine protocols, that areas were blocked off, bars, businesses closed, uh, and that was by public health divisions. If we look at even the city of New York, you might have heard of Ellis Island, and that was actually a quarantine location in which a lot of the diseases moving over into the new world of America, people were required to stay there for a period of time. It was moved off, and they had to remain in that area until they were allowed into the country to prevent some of like the tuberculosis and various other diseases from moving into the new world. You may also see this at any sort of border guards, that they have these types of stations where they prevent certain fruits, vegetables, all these sorts of objects. Australia is well known for this problem, and that's because they're trying to keep various diseases out. So the idea of a quarantine is not new. And where does this really come from? What is the genesis of this? Is actually rather biblical. Quarantine is stemming from the Italian word for 40. And the idea here was that they would keep ships off the port during the Black Death. They would keep them off port for 40 days and 40 nights and deliver to them food, water, essentials in order to prevent diseases from entering into such cities as Florence and Naples, etc. And that's where we get our modern day word of quarantine, 40 days. And where does 40 days come from? Well, that was considered at the time, that biblical number of 40, that since Jesus went into the desert for 40 days and 40 nights to face the devil, that was the amount of time required to deal with a disease, was 40 days and 40 nights. So the fact that we're only in here for 14 and not 40, well, it's because we figured out more of what the gestation period is for COVID 19 and have more of a sense of how long we should keep someone in place over that time period. So, a little bit of a historical fact for you. This is not an unprecedented time. This is something that has happened throughout human history quite a few times in terms of it. Even the ideas of going outside into nature, sitting outside, get your vitamin D in. They would do this with the 1918 flu pandemic group and those afflicted with various other diseases in the past. There was this idea of miasma or mal-air. In fact, the word malaria, comes from mal-air, bad air. And because of this belief that smells and etc. cause diseases, this is why, for example, you would have these early versions of hazmat suits being worn by plague doctors. You know, the big giant beaky guys? That was in order to fill that nose, would be filled with various herbs and other elements in order to put good smells into you. And we can see why you would think this. A lot of death, disease, all of these things have poor smells. And so the belief was is that if you were in an area with this bad air, that you would get this virus. So they were basically providing to their doctors, or the acting against those doctors, they had basically went on to a hazmat suit. It was a big giant bird-like mask that kept them at certain distances away from their patients. They would also wear large leather trench coats, partially because it would protect against various splashes, movements, etc. Gloves, the pokey stick, all of that was really in order to provide some amount of distance from their patients, because they didn't have a good sense of how these things were transmitted and moved through. They just had this idea of the bad air. I mean, really, what's COVID doing right now? It is kind of a mal air, a bad air. So that's kind of a historical look at the pandemic at day 7 of the quarantine. Stay safe, everyone. Wash your hands.